Before we get started, I just wanted to do one technical note for the group, which is you'll see on the chat feature on your screen, if you have your screen open, you can send questions or comments to the Q&A group. That Q&A feature is the space where you'll be able to send us questions for the Q&A session afterwards as we go along, as they occur to you. Feel free to send them to us, and we'll get to as many of them as we can during the call, and maybe we'll get some of them after the call as well. Without further ado, I want to welcome everyone to the webinar, Tools for Teachers, Strategies for Addressing Racial Dynamics in the Classroom, sponsored by the National Coalition on School Diversity. My name is Phil Tegeler. I'm with the Poverty and Race Research Action Council. We're a civil rights policy group based in Washington, D.C., and our organization is a founding member of the National Coalition on School Diversity, along with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the ACLU, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, national groups, and we're just helping to put on this webinar today. Before we get started, I wanted to say a few words about the National Coalition on School Diversity and then introduce our presenters. The National Coalition on School Diversity is a 5-year-old national network of over 30 civil rights organizations, university-based research centers, and state and local coalitions working to expand support for government policies that promote school diversity and reduce racial and economic isolation in schools. Our work is informed by an advisory panel of scholars and academic researchers, including our speakers today, Rachel Godsil and Linda Tropp. And the Coalition publishes a series of research briefs that summarize the best current evidence on the benefits of racial and economic integration and how to make integrated schools work better for kids. Much of the Coalition's advocacy work focuses on reforming policies on school diversity at the Federal Department of Education, but we also support efforts at the state and local level. Most recently this week, the Coalition and several Coalition members submitted testimony at the New York City Council on an innovative set of City Council resolutions to increase diversity in the highly segregated New York City school system. Today's webinar will be sharing some powerful new insights on the related impacts of implicit bias, stereotype threat, and racial anxiety in the classroom, and what educators can do to constructively address these issues. Our first speaker is Rachel Godsil. Rachel is a professor of law at Seton Law School in Newark and director of research for the Perception Institute, which is a national consortium of social scientists, academics, lawyers, and social justice advocates that's focusing on the implications of the mind sciences for policy, culture, and institutions. Rachel lectures regularly to judges, judicial conferences, government agencies, lawyers, and public interest organizations about implicit bias, racial anxiety, and stereotype threat. And I'm lucky that she is also a member of my organization's board of directors, and we're very grateful for all of her help. Linda Tropp is a professor of psychology and director of the Psychology of Peace and Violence program at UMass Amherst. Linda's research concerns how members of different groups approach and experience contact with each other. She has worked with national organizations to present social science evidence in court cases on racial integration and on state and national initiatives to promote interracial relations in schools. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from both Rachel and Linda right now. Without further ado, let me turn it over to Rachel Godsil.
Thank you, Phil. And it is very much an honor to be presenting this information to this group. I can see some of the participant lists, and I see friends and colleagues on the list. And I wish we were all in a large space so we could actually see one another. So in some sense, I'm coming to this information similar to many of you. As well as being a lawyer and law professor, I'm also a teacher. And when I became informed about some of the insights from the social sciences focusing on implicit bias, racial anxiety, and stereotype threat, I have to say it spoke to me in my 12 years as a teacher and my experience with my kids in public schools. And so this audience, in some sense, is the most important audience for me to share this information in the hopes that it can be useful to all of you. Because what I think is surprising is, frankly, there nonetheless are incredible challenges and some conundrums around the experiences of kids of color in the classroom that seem counterintuitive. And bringing together the research insights from implicit bias, racial anxiety, and stereotype threat, and I feel extraordinarily lucky to have been working with Linda, who'll be speaking next, as well as with Philippa Goff, who's one of our co-authors, and John Powell, as well as many others from Perception Institute on this work. I think there are some insights that will help explain some of the otherwise seemingly kind of counterintuitive challenges that occur in classrooms even taught by teachers of extraordinary goodwill. But also, most excitingly, there's an array of new interventions and, frankly, very straightforward practices that we can all engage in that can ideally help us overcome some of these challenges and create the context for all kids, but particularly for kids of color in the classroom that we've always wanted to create. So I'll just begin with a couple of the challenges and what seem kind of otherwise inexplicable. Probably most of you are familiar with the fact that there are extremely disturbing, disproportionate discipline and suspension rates for kids of color. Most people on this call probably don't assume that's because kids of color are engaging in, vastly worse behavior, but many in the country do. And so social scientists, of course, have studied this. And what they found is that it is not, in fact, violence or some sort of action by Black and Latino students that are found most linked to disproportionate discipline and suspension disparities. Rather, it's for subjective and seemingly sort of minor infractions like disrespect and loitering. So that's one sort of conundrum. Why is this happening? Why are Black and Latino students being suspended at highly disproportionate levels for things like disrespect and loitering? Another conundrum is, frankly, the achievement gap. I think, this is something we've been working on for years. We, of course, know there are material realities and structural barriers and some explanations for why there continues to be an achievement gap for African-American and Latino kids versus white and Asian kids. But frankly, even those don't explain the degree of the gap. And one thing that has been extraordinarily helpful to me, frankly, in my own experience of seeing students even at the law school level where there's a gender and race gap as well, is understanding the phenomena of stereotype threat, which, as I'll explain later, is essentially the underlying concern about confirming negative stereotypes about one's group that has been found to explain at least a significant portion of this quote-unquote gap. And what's important about this concept, this idea that anxiety about whether or not one's performance in kind of highly charged settings like standardized tests might suggest something about, being a girl or math and science or kids of color's capacities in other academic contexts, is there are interventions where we can engage. So this meta-analysis of randomized field experiments involving more than 15,000 students found that as a result of this stereotype threat, there is a significant underestimation of the capacities of kids of color. And it's been estimated to approximate 62 points on the SAT, to use a number that's sort of familiar to many of us. And the final conundrum is often, we're aware of the specter, even if hopefully it's sort of a small number, but we're aware of the specter of the teachers who are unable to see the capacities of kids of color and the sort of, and what we assume to be for many, perhaps the implicit bias that makes it difficult for them to see kids of color as capable. But it turns out there's something else happening in many classrooms that also undermines and affects students of color's continued educational growth. And that's actually that some teachers, and frankly, I think it's teachers like me who care so much that we're sort of trying to be supportive and trying to be the nice teacher, we're not giving students of color enough critical feedback. So in a few studies, Kent Harbor at Rutgers has done several studies in this phenomena, and in the study that I described here in 2012, intentionally poorly written essays were sent to 126 middle school students in the Northeast who were asked to provide feedback for the students who were believed to be either white, Black, or Latino. And what Professor Harbor found was that teachers provided less critical feedback to Latino and Black students than they did to white students. They gave equal levels of mechanical corrections, but they didn't provide them the sort of feedback necessary for growth. They were sort of general and generic in the praise, with one exception. Teachers who were in schools where they were receiving social support from principals and fellow teachers gave equal levels of critical feedback to Black students, but not to Latino students. And what that suggests is that there are different reasons why these lesser levels and, frankly, insufficient levels of critical feedback are being given to Black and Latino students in some instances. For the Latino students, it probably is implicit bias, the set of assumptions about perhaps their capacity as writers. But for the Black students, it's this other phenomena, which is kind of linked to stereotype threat, but also racial anxiety, which Linda will be talking about later. It's the concern that the teachers will be perceived as racist and the desire to sort of be the good non-racist teacher that may be animated activity that's well-intentioned, but obviously isn't in the interest of students. So what we hope to do in the study that we produced that is available online, The Science of Equality, is to synthesize all of the research, or as much of the research as we possibly could, on these related phenomena: implicit bias, racial anxiety, and stereotype threat, link them to some degree to important domains, in this case education and healthcare, and then talk about some of the really exciting avenues for intervention and change. So here is a little bit of information, just the idea that the halcyon days of the 70s have gotten so much worse in terms of racist suspension is just something deeply disturbing, and it's important for us to realize that it isn't the actions of particularly the Black students and the Latino students, but perhaps another set of phenomena, either implicit bias perhaps, or we'll talk a little bit about how racial anxiety or stereotype threat may potentially be feeding into the disproportionate suspensions and disciplinaries as well. So again, what the research suggests is that multiple phenomena are likely at play to help us understand why race continues apart from the material realities, apart from the structural realities that we know we need to address, why race, even in reasonably well-funded classrooms, even in reasonably integrated schools, continues to be a challenge. And what we're hoping this research can do is help unpack some of that and provide some suggestions for practice change. So some of you, I probably are familiar with the idea of implicit bias, and I'm going to spend more of my time on stereotype threat, which I think is a less familiar concept. But the basic idea of implicit bias is, again, we're presuming, and the research certainly supports, that the vast majority of Americans, and certainly teachers, don't adhere to explicit negative stereotypes about stigmatized racial groups. Those have been rejected. Teachers very much want to be non-racist, and their conscious values are completely sort of aligned with the anti-racist goals. And yet, we all live in a toxic culture. We all live in our toxic culture where we're bombarded with imagery and images and notions that stigmatized groups continue to be stigmatized. And so that has been shown to sort of play in our unconscious brain, and therefore we have implicit, unconscious biases against groups, even as we hold consciously and very sincerely positive and egalitarian values. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but for those of you who haven't yet taken the implicit association test, which can be found just by Googling Project Implicit or Implicit Association Test, it's an exercise that gives you a little bit of insight into what might be some implicit biases that you have even while you hold conscious values. And the way it does this is it essentially sees whether you can as quickly press a button linking positive words with sort of both white faces and black faces, or both white faces and Latino faces, or white faces and Asian faces, or if you're a person of color, whether some people of color have positive biases toward their own group. Many people of color are essentially equal. They can as quickly make positive associations between their own group and whites. And there are some people of color who, again, we all live in this toxic culture, who themselves may have an easier time more quickly associate positive words with the dominant group in our culture, white, than with stigmatized groups. So this is not a DNA test. The IAT is a vehicle. It's been taken by millions of people, and it gives us useful general information. It can give you a little bit of information about yourself, but it's malleable, it's changeable, and again, it shouldn't be understood to sort of brand you as actually a racist. Rather, it's an indication perhaps that most of us, I think, have to be mindful that race may play a role, or ethnicity may play a role in the way that we see and behave, because essentially implicit bias has been found to be more predictive, particularly when we're moving quickly and not mindfully in some instances than our conscious values. So this is an example of, I think, implicit bias at work. And it was not done by social scientists, and so I can't promise its rigor to the degree of the peer-reviewed studies that we generally study, but it was a study done of a significant number of law firm partners. And these law firm partners, who have every reason, both moral and frankly economic, to be enthusiastic about having associates of color, were given a memo that was one half thought was written by a white third-year associate who's gone to NYU, Tom Meyer. Another half thought was written by a black Tom Meyer who went to NYU. And you can see from the comments that the reaction to the identical memo was not identical. And the comments themselves are sort of inflammatory. What I think in this context actually bears even more attention is the difference in the number of spelling and grammatical errors that were found. So in the context of our middle school teachers, we're finding spelling and grammar errors as sort of itself mechanical. Teachers, even though they're giving different levels of critical feedback, are finding the same number of errors. But frankly, for law firm associates, what we see is when a white associate makes a spelling error, it obviously goes somewhat unheeded because the partners didn't find most of the spelling errors. But when a black associate makes a spelling error, it triggers a button, and those partners become eagle-eyed, and they find virtually all of the spelling and grammatical errors. And those spelling and grammatical errors undoubtedly fall into what we call confirmation bias, where the underlying stereotypes that these partners appear to have about the capacities of black associates come into play, obviously leading to a much more negative conclusion about black associates. And obviously this is exactly the fear that many people of color have. I've got to be twice as good because any mistake I make is going to be used against me. So the other thing to be aware of, and particularly in the context of, for those of us as teachers, because much of what we do is relational, is implicit bias is not merely a cognitive enterprise. It's not just what you see when you're looking at papers or what kinds of decisions we make. It's also displayed by our body language. And so researchers have done work having one set of researchers know someone's implicit association score, knowing whether they're high implicit bias or not. Another set of researchers not being aware of whether someone is or isn't, and coding their conduct when they're in interracial interactions, and finding that people who have high levels of implicit bias are likely to show less warm body language, less eye contact, more distancing. And that's the kind of thing that we obviously need to be deeply aware of in the classroom, because as we know, kids pick up on those nonverbal cues. Basically, we all do, but I think kids are probably even more sensitive to them, and hence they're extraordinarily important. So confirmation bias, this may well have something to do with how the same conduct by a kid of color in a classroom may be read differently and may be read as more serious or significant than conduct by a white student. If we have a set of assumptions about behavior, we see the identical behavior differently depending upon who's doing it. So if you look at a picture of the kids, that looks like kids playing in the woods. One kid's hands are outstretched. If those kids were African American, might that be read as one kid pushing another? That's the sort of thing that researchers have found, and the kind of thing we have to be aware of and concerned about and make sure doesn't affect our valuations of conduct. So what can be done? This is the sort of very much a bird's eye view. But what's exciting is there is fairly new research in the last couple of years led by Patricia Devine at the University of Wisconsin, but based on a whole host of researchers, some of whom are Linda's colleagues, Pooja Dasgupta, University of Massachusetts, and others, who are actually identifying practices that result in reducing bias. And I'll address those briefly. Most of us think it is unrealistic, or most of the researchers rather, I'm sort of a headline person for the researchers, think that we can't count on being able to utterly eliminate our biases, again, particularly in light of the barrage of negative stereotypes that we continue to be experiencing, even as we're working to reduce bias. So the interventions that have been identified that I call bias override, institutional practices to limit the behavioral effects of implicit bias are important as well. And in our study, we go into those in great detail. But it's important to note that ideally, those institutional practices will be contextualized to the particular setting that you're in. If you're in a school or if you're an advocate working with schools, will be contextualized to the particular setting to be most effective. Again, just sort of briefly, there are several steps that Patricia Devine and her colleagues identified as leading to reduction in implicit bias, as well as greater concern about discrimination, and most excitingly, and you'll hear why this is so exciting when Linda starts, I'm going to move even more quickly, a greater interest in interracial engagement and contact. These are the sort of, just the taglines of what these steps are. During question and answer, we can answer more about what these actually require, and in our paper, we describe in great detail I'm going to move quickly to stereotype threats. I know we don't have that much time. Linda has been, I think, crucially important to the group of particularly lawyers and law professors who come to think about the mind sciences and implicit bias, and having us recognize that as important as implicit bias is, it's not the silver bullet, and there are other dynamics that social psychologists have identified that are as important, and particularly be mindful that these other phenomena may inadvertently be triggered by attempts to reduce implicit bias if we're not cautious. And so again, she'll be talking about racial anxiety. I'll talk briefly about stereotype threat because it has particular salience in the classroom. So the basic idea of stereotype threat is this worry that our behavior will confirm a negative stereotype about our group. Jerry Kong, with whom I wrote an amicus brief in the Fisher case, likens it to a headwind that essentially only one runner in the race is experiencing. Everyone else has the wind at their back. It's an impediment to performing to capacity, and the research is very powerful about its effects in the classroom. So this is actually kind of a funny example. Don't really have time for it, but some suggest that George Bush might actually have had stereotype threat as well. People estimate his SAT score to be vastly lower than it actually was. He was a much better speaker when he was governor than when he became president. But again, this is a little bit of a side. Here's actual evidence of stereotype threat in the context of math and science and women's performance. And what we can see is when women are told or where it's indicated that women are worse than math and mathematics, women are in green, they do vastly less well than they do when they're told that there isn't a difference in gender performance in math. We can also note the stereotype lift that the men experience when they understand men to be better at math and science. This is an experiment about something called growth mindset. So growth mindset, some of you may be familiar with the concept. Carol Dweck is most associated with it. It's the idea, again, like implicit bias isn't fixed, neither is capacity for learning and academic achievement. And what Josh Aronson, who's another person we work with, and some of his colleagues found is this idea of imparting growth mindset to students can have an effect on their performance on math tests. So those students who have a growth mindset when they were engaging in a math performance, as you can see, were able to perform significantly better than the students who didn't have a growth mindset, particularly when there was a race prompt, when there's this recognition of race being salient or when they have to identify their race. Another question, can psychological interventions raise test scores of minority students? In this study, actually, two different interventions were used. This idea of intelligence being malleable, being able to increase one's capacities, and a second, this idea of role modeling, where senior students have communicated or conveyed to middle school students that it's normal to experience early difficulty in school. That's okay, most people experience that, and it can be transcended. And then another group were given a drug abuse message, don't engage in drugs, that's bad for you. What we see is that on the 7th grade reading test, the control group, the kids who were told not to engage in drug use, were least successful. These are otherwise similar cohorts of students. Students who were given the malleability intervention were significantly more successful, and the students who had a role model who conveyed how normal their experience of feeling difficulty is were the most successful. So these interventions really can have efficacy in the sort of high-stakes context of tests. So I'm sorry I went a little long, but there's so much more information to convey. I'm really excited to turn the floor over to Linda because her research is so exciting. And to the extent that you have more questions or would like to engage more with the material, we do have a support. It's available online, and I look forward to questions and answers, and thank you for your attention.
So thanks so much, Rachel. It was great to hear you summarize a lot of the work from our field, and I'm delighted to be presenting with Rachel, and especially as a professor doing my best to try to make more accessible some of the research studies that serve as a foundation for a lot of the strategies to promote reductions in bias and reductions in anxiety for those of you who might not be as accustomed to reading academic journals. So a lot of what I study has to do with intergroup contact, what happens when members of different groups interact, and how this can be an effective strategy for reducing racial bias and anxiety. And in particular, there's a fair amount of research from the last half century showing that greater intergroup contact can help to reduce prejudice and bias between groups, and particularly when it occurs under situations that exemplify what are known as optimal conditions for intergroup contact, such as when the groups have equal status in that contact situation. So regardless of their broader statuses in the larger society, that they are brought together and treated and regarded as equals when they interact with each other. Next would be cooperative interdependence, suggesting that the groups really need to work together and rely on each other in order to achieve their shared goals. And then institutional support, which would involve authorities, norms, laws, and customs of institutions explicitly indicating that, yes, members of these groups should interact with each other and that they should do so as equals. So just to acquaint you with some of the work that I've done and to try to make it a little more user-friendly for you, with Tom Pettigrew, I've conducted what's known as a meta-analysis of research on intergroup contact. A meta-analysis is basically a quantitative integration, or the type of research study where you try to pull every research study ever conducted on a topic, and you statistically pull the results to see overall what does that research literature tell you. So ours is based on over 500 studies that were conducted between the 1940s and the year 2000 with over 250,000 participants from 38 countries. And you'll see, I'm not going to go through this in depth, but our participants came from many different types of target groups, including racial and ethnic groups, as well as other types of groups, people with or without mental illness or mental disability, people from different age groups and many different contact settings, such as people coming into contact in educational settings, workplace settings, neighborhoods, and so on. Just to give you an overview of what this research shows, we do find that the answer to the general question, does contact reduce prejudice and bias? The general answer to that general question is yes. Greater contact overall is associated with lower levels of prejudice between groups. And I want to give you a sense of what you're looking at in this graph here. Each of these little blue dots or diamonds in the graph represents one of those studies of the 500 that we had showing a relationship between contact and prejudice in that study. Now, if you look at the x-axis or the horizontal line where it says contact prejudice correlation, where it says 0.0, that basically means that there's no meaningful relationship between contact and prejudice. But as you can see, the bulk of the studies appear to the left of that 0.0 point, suggesting that greater contact is associated with less prejudice. It's an inverse, or what's called a negative correlation, where one variable goes up as the other variable goes down. So in our case, greater contact between groups is typically associated with lower levels of intergroup prejudice, and the mean of that relationship across all of those studies is represented by the red line in the middle of that distribution, corresponding to a correlation coefficient R of negative 0.21, for those of you familiar with statistical terminology. I can also just mention that these effects of contact and reducing prejudice are very similar when we look at different age groups, children, adolescents, college students, or adults, different target groups, such as I was saying before, racial and ethnic groups, different age groups where elderly are negatively stereotyped in relation to younger people, people with or without mental illness, or physical disabilities or mental disabilities, across different contact settings like educational settings and workplace settings, and also across not only the United States, but in different national contexts around. All right, so I also wanted to talk a little bit about how contact reduces prejudice. For a really long time, the research community has basically just seen a pretty linear relationship that greater contact is associated with less prejudice. But what we find is that there are actually a few different mechanisms through which contact is effective in reducing prejudice. And one of these involves knowledge, that as you have contact with members of other groups, the more you learn about them, the more knowledge you gain about them. And that increased knowledge and familiarity is oftentimes associated with less prejudice. But even more than simply knowledge, aspects of our emotional factors like anxiety and empathy have been shown to play even greater roles. So in particular, when you have greater contact across members of different groups, that tends to be associated with reductions in anxiety in relation to those groups. And that lowered anxiety is associated with lowered prejudice. It's kind of a positive relationship there between anxiety and prejudice. More anxiety means more prejudice, lower anxiety means less prejudice. And also we find that greater contact is associated with greater empathy, greater ability and willingness to empathize with other groups, take their perspectives and understand their concerns. The more empathy we experience in relation to other groups, the less prejudice and bias as a result. All right, so here I just want to show you a summary of that dotted graph that I showed you at the very beginning with all of the little blue diamonds. This is basically showing the exact same effect where that 0 point means there's no meaningful relationship between contact and prejudice. Higher schools would mean that contact is associated with less prejudice, but the mean correlation between contact and prejudice is represented by that blue bar, which was the red line in that distribution I showed you before, showing that greater contact is typically associated with lower prejudice between groups. And I wanted to give you that sample graph because you'll see a couple of different slides I'll be showing in the rest of my presentation, showing that compared to the overall effect of contact across all of those studies included in our analysis, we see significantly greater reductions in prejudice from contact when that contact involves friendships between members of different groups. Now, I should mention in this analysis, most of those studies were survey studies where people were asked if they have friends in other groups and then asked about their prejudice attitudes, and there we saw that greater contact as friends was associated with less prejudice. And in the next slide, I want to show you how we actually sought to test through experimental means that greater contact actually can cause reductions in prejudice, testing the causal relationship there. So here we recruited white and Latino undergraduate participants, and we randomly assigned them to either have a same ethnic or a same group partner or a cross-ethnic partner in dyad. So before the first meeting, we had them complete a measure of implicit bias or implicit prejudice, the IAP, like what Nicole described at the beginning of her presentation. And we also asked them to provide saliva samples. And in saliva, there's the hormone cortisol, which gives us a sense of people's stress responses, how stressed they are feeling in an interaction. So after this baseline assessment, we had these friendship dyads return to the lab for three friendship building meetings where they engaged in self-disclosure and interdependent cooperative tasks representing the types of intimacy building and optimal contact conditions that I was talking about before. And at the end of each of these friendship meetings, they also provided a saliva sample so we could compare their cortisol level at the end of this friendship meeting compared to the baseline estimate. And then after all three of these friendship meetings, we asked participants to keep diaries for 10 days where they reported on how many cross-race interactions they initiated. So first, to speak to the cortisol reactivity issue, what we find is a really interesting interaction relationship among those who were paired with a cross-ethnic partner, so whites paired with Latinos or Latinos paired with whites. And here you can see the differences represented by the lines in this graph for people who had high implicit prejudice scores or high IAP scores with the circles at the end of the line as compared to people with lower levels of implicit bias or lower levels of implicit prejudice with a triangle at the end of their line. What we find is that people who were high in prejudice showed greater cortisol reactivity or a greater stress response at the first friendship meeting. What this is saying is, for those people who were paired with a cross-ethnic partner, they were stressed out at that first friendship meeting compared to the stress levels they had at baseline. But it's really important that we see that over time, across repeated opportunities to interact with that partner, that stress response attenuates, such that they showed similar levels of stress, similar lower levels of stress to those who were paired with a same group partner and to those who had lower levels of prejudice. And you can also see here with the lines dotted with triangles that those with low levels of prejudice were relatively unfazed by interacting with a member of another group. It's really those who were high in prejudice that show the stressors. And we also see similar effects for those who were high in prejudice paired with a cross-race partner, a cross-ethnic partner, in terms of their responses in the diary portion of the study. So those who were paired with a cross-ethnic partner, and particularly those who were high in implicit prejudice, after having this cross-friend experience, they were more likely, significantly more likely, to initiate future cross-group interactions than those who were paired with a same ethnic partner. So together, these types of findings seem to be suggesting that experimentally, by having cross-ethnic friendship experience, we can lead people to experience less stress or anxiety in cross-group interactions and be more willing to initiate and engage in future cross-group interactions. So in addition to looking at the contact or the type of contact that matter in terms of friendship, we also wanted to look and see whether contact structure under optimal conditions like equal status between groups, with cooperative interdependence, and institutional support makes a difference. And we find that it does, that when the contact occurs under these types of optimal conditions, we also see significantly greater reductions in prejudice resulting from the contact. I also just wanted to mention, given that this is an education-oriented audience, that we've done really similar analyses looking only at those samples in our studies that examine effects among children and adolescents in K through 12 school settings. And we find even among those cases that greater contact is associated with reduced prejudice, and particularly when the contact is structured under optimal conditions. And we can see that this is the case both for those studies that involve the racial ethnic context between youth in K-12 schools, as well as other groups, and also particularly when it occurs under optimal conditions, that for racial and ethnic groups as well as for other groups such as kids with and without mental or physical disabilities, we find really similar effects, that generally we see that contact is prejudice, and particularly when the contact occurs under optimal conditions, like I described. I also wanted to highlight some other ways in which we can think about creating optimal conditions in classrooms. And there are a couple that are highly stressed in the research literature. If we want to really focus on the role of interdependence, our cooperative learning strategies that educators often use, well known within our research community, is the model of the Jigsaw Classroom by Elliot Aronson and his colleagues, where essentially students within a classroom are assigned in smaller clusters to master different pieces of course material. So imagine, for example, that there was an educational or teaching unit on Native Americans, and that some kids in the classroom would be asked to learn about Native American history, others about Native American religious practices, others about other aspects of Native American culture, and those would be regarded as mastery groups, where they learned that piece of the lesson plan with a level of mastery, so that then the teacher would reorganize the classroom into what are known as jigsaw groups, which would include one representative from each of those mastery groups. And their job in those jigsaw groups is to teach all other kids in their group about the information that they mastered. So what Elliot Aronson describes is that what this allows kids to do is to take a role of teaching each other the course material and also putting them in the role of having to listen to all of the other students in the class, which helps to increase interdependence, that all kids are kind of working together towards a common goal of learning all aspects of the course material. And we can also think about how this might equalize the status of the kids in the classroom, and other strategies for also enhancing the status and equalizing the status of all kids in the classroom is by balancing the racial and ethnic composition of kids in the classroom and having other ways of representing the different cultures of kids in that classroom. And just to give you an example from one of these studies, we looked at the interethnic attitudes of young white children in K-through second grade classrooms in Central California. And these classrooms were varied in terms of the proportions of Latino students that were in those classrooms with the white students and the levels of instruction in English and Spanish. This was over some classes that were predominantly white with only English-only instruction, some that were more ethnically mixed, still with only English instruction, and others that were ethnically mixed with English and Spanish bilingual. So what we basically did was we put target photographs of the same age children who were Latino or white, and these were matched by gender and physical attractiveness, and we put them in front of these kids and asked the children in the classroom individually who they would pick and like as best friends, and they were asked to select those target photographs. And to show you some of the effects in the next slide, you can see that here are the white children's friendship preferences based on their selections of those target photographs. And you can see that the white children in predominantly white English-only classrooms showed a really great bias in their selection of white targets compared to Latino targets, choosing many more white targets compared to Latino targets. But we start to see this gap narrowing among those white children in racially or ethnically mixed classes, even with English-only instruction, and then also in ethnically mixed classes where there was bilingual instruction, suggesting that the greater the ethnic diversity in the composition of the classroom and also the greater representation of different cultures and languages in the classroom can help to narrow this gap in friendship preferences among young white children. I also just wanted to briefly mention some other factors that can help to reduce racial bias and prejudice and also promote more positive relations between diverse groups within classrooms. And in part, some of the research that we and others have done and continue to do focuses on how perceived support for cross-ethnic contact among one's in-group peers, one's same ethnic peers, and among also teachers and principals within the school can predict children's greater interest in cross-group friendships, that kids report being more interested in developing friendships with members of other groups. And I also just want to highlight that this relates in part to what Rachel was describing with the Harvard research showing that teachers in schools who felt supported by their schools gave more critical feedback to students of color, that this suggests that the norms of the school environment are not only important for students in shifting their interracial attitudes and willingness to engage in contact, but may also be really important for teachers as well. And there's also a concept of extended contact, suggesting that when we know that members of our group are friends with people in other groups, that in and of itself can lead us to be more willing to engage in contact and to lead us to develop more positive attitudes towards those other groups. So just to conclude, I really want to highlight that both reducing racial and ethnic prejudice and bias, as well as racial and ethnic anxiety, can effectively be reduced through contact between different groups. We're especially likely to observe these positive effects of contact when the contact involves close relationships across group boundaries, such as cross-group friendships, and when it occurs under optimal conditions like equal status with cooperative interdependence and institutional support. And we can observe these positive effects of contact both when children develop cross-ethnic friendships themselves and when they observe others' friendships with different racial and ethnic groups in their social environments. And here I think it's also important to emphasize that part of this happens because people see supportive norms for cross-group relations, both among their peers and also within their school environments among teachers and school staff, that can really play an important and crucial role, I believe, in promoting interest in contact and the development of contact friendship. So I will stop there, and hopefully we still have some time for questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Linda. And this is Phil again. Now, we don't have a lot of time left, and I do want to encourage people to keep sending in questions to us, and we'll try to do some, FAQs after the session. But I wanted to highlight a couple questions that have come in so far. One set of questions is about, and you addressed this a little bit, Linda, but I thought we should dig into a little more. What do we do about the extremely isolated, particularly predominantly white schools with white faculty? If you're in a faculty that really is heavily white faculty, what can the faculty do in that situation? And if you're in a school that is really kind of a racially isolated white school, how do you implement some of these practices without the benefit of intergroup contact in the classroom?
Oh, I think that's a great question. And I think having cues that represent the value of diversity in classroom and school settings can be really important. So in some of the schools where I've conducted research, I've gone into the guidance office, and there's lots of posters showing how supportive of diversity we are, that everyone is welcome and included here. And I think that can send cues to the white students, as well as setting a norm for white teachers and faculty and administrators that diversity is valued here. We might not have a large representation of students of color or teachers of color in our school, but this is something that we value. We think it's important, and we are essentially saying it's important to be allied in working toward racial justice and making people be less fearful about the prospect of interacting with groups in the future, because it seems more normative, more normal, more accepted, more familiar when you have at least those diversity cues in the school environment.
Okay, and what about the age group for, what's an optimal age group for implementing some of the strategies you've set out? Are we really talking about high school kids, or is it better to start at an earlier age? Has that been looked into?
Yep, so, I think this is a great question. I don't know that there have been studies, unfortunately, trying to get grant funding to follow the same kids for 15 or 20 years is just not as possible. But there have been some studies, either kind of single assessment studies or short-term longitudinal studies with very young kids, like at the K through second grade, or middle school kids or high school kids. And I think, based on my experience, they're all important, and perhaps for different reasons. So I think at the very young ages, that's when kids are starting to form stereotypes and understandings about different groups. Really between the ages of 4 and 7 is when they start getting what society has as racial and ethnic stereotypes. So at those ages, it seems particularly important to broaden kids' perspective, broaden their understanding of what's normal, what's familiar, whether it's through field trips if there's not diversity within the school, providing cooperative learning strategies, celebrating different cultural traditions in the school settings, and reinforcing that familiarity at a very young age. I think you encounter a different set of issues when you get to the middle school years, and this is where a lot of the research I've done is currently located, because kids are dealing with more identity issues, and they're in some ways making the transition from thinking of parents and perhaps teachers and educators as being authorities, so looking to their peers and thinking about what will be cool or not cool, what will be accepted or not accepted. And so reintroducing it at the very least at those ages is also really important, and that might be where you would use a combination of school-based strategies and peer-based strategies. In a recent school where I've done research, they actually took a survey of the kids and asked them about their cross-ethnic friendships and then put posters around the school basically saying, did you know that like 3 out of the 4 kids in this school have friends who are really different from us? That might be a way of getting people to think like, oh, whether we talk about it or not, it's actually an acceptable thing. A lot of people have friends who are different from us. So I hope that answers at least in part that question.
That's really fascinating. The next question I'll pitch initially to Rachel. Some of the evidence that you were presenting, Rachel, about the ways that racial anxiety tends to influence some teachers who are not that self-aware to give feedback differently to kids of different racial and ethnic groups, perhaps not being as critical in feedback to an African-American or Latino child. What are some ways of kind of inoculating oneself against that as a teacher? Are there techniques that have been shown to work to address that kind of racial anxiety and the impact of that in the classroom?
Yes, there's actually a very, very straightforward technique that is both helpful to the teacher and to the students based on the work of Cohen and Steele. And it's the idea of wise criticism, where it is true that the teacher part of the reason for the less critical feedback may be the teacher's instinct that the student won't receive the criticism well. And that's sometimes true because one of the challenges for students of color is, the phrase is, the social scientific phrase is attributional ambiguity, not knowing whether the critical feedback they're getting is as a result of bias, like the Tom Myers study, or is real and something they should respond to. So the way that the teacher can be sure that the criticism that they're giving will be received in the constructive way that they intend it, and a way to sort of reassure teachers giving critical feedback is itself a sort of egalitarian, non-racist act, is to teach teachers essentially the mechanisms of wise criticism, which essentially can be boiled down to the idea of clearly communicating to students that the teacher has high expectations for the student. And because of those high expectations and because the teacher thinks the student is capable of meeting those expectations, here is a set of feedback. And this has actually been tested both in college students and in middle school with middle school students. And so there's a study by Yeager in 2013 where one set of African-American students were given a feedback simply saying, I'm giving you these comments, so you have feedback on their essay, a bunch of critical comments. Only 17% of the Black students chose to revise and resubmit. But when a note read, I'm giving you these comments because I have high standards and I know that you can meet them, 71% of the Black students revised and resubmitted their essay. So for teachers to understand that their instinct that there may be some, sort of response on the part of the students of color, that instinct is real, but that instinct essentially can be overcome and made into a really valuable instructional and mentoring experience if the teachers themselves understand that sort of they're communicating why they're giving the feedback. It's because they think so highly of the student and because they think highly of the student's capacity, that will inspire the students to essentially do their best work. I think, again, that's hopefully helpful both for the teacher and understanding how to give the criticism and understanding what it is that prompted that instinct in the first place, and that it is a reasonable and sort of laudable instinct.
I'm going to pitch one or two more of these questions, but we're going to have to be stopping in a few minutes. But I want to encourage people to continue sending in questions. We'll leave the screen open for a while, because we're getting a stream of excellent questions, and I'd like to, in written form, respond to some of them and post them later for everyone to see. So please keep sending those in. There's really quite an interesting group of Q&A we're getting. The one I wanted to focus on, how might we promote self-selected intergroup contact outside the classroom, in other words, during lunch and recess, etc., that is authentic?
I'm just going to jump in on that one, if that's all right. This is Linda. So one of the strategies that I think is a great approach is sponsored by the Southern Poverty Law Center, their Mix It Up program, and it's basically kind of a school-oriented, a school-level idea where it's say, kids, let's just mix it up for one day. Just sit at a table that's really different than the one that you usually sit at, and just see how things go. And I think if there's kind of, again, that normative environment that encourages that type of cross-group interaction, then it doesn't put the pressure on the kids to do something that is potentially counter-normative or where they might be scrutinized by their peers as being supported by the school. we had the institutional support of those school authorities saying, yeah, let's give it a go, try to meet someone new. And I think in particular, and this also relates to the previous comments about giving feedback, it helps people know what to do. When people feel anxious or uncomfortable, they hunker down, they kind of revert back to what's comfortable and familiar. So to the extent that using a mix-it-up type of procedure, you could also set some explicit goals or give people instructions. Like tell the kids, you want to learn 3 things about this person that you didn't know before. It gives them a goal, something to work towards, which reduces some of the awkwardness or anxiety associated with just trying to start a conversation with somebody new. And I would also just briefly add that extracurriculars like sports teams in particular have been shown to be one of the most effective places for positive contact between groups because there are very clear norms about what you're supposed to do together, and your performance is less ambiguous, highlighting what Rachel was describing. You play on the field if you're a good player, if you practice hard, if you're part of the team working together. But it gives people opportunities for contact as kind of a byproduct of working together because they care about them.
We did promise that this would be an hour-long session, so I'm going to wrap it up right now and say a few more things. First of all, the PowerPoint and the webinar, and hopefully written responses from our panelists to these excellent questions that have been coming in will be posted in about a week, and we'll send out an email to everyone who was on the call today with the information on how to access that, and we'll share it more widely as well with the National Coalition on School Diversity mailing list. I think everyone who signed up for this webinar will now automatically be on the Coalition's email list. You can always opt out if you wish, but you shouldn't be getting some excellent monthly emails from us. More webinars like this and also other really important and valuable resources on promoting school diversity. Thank you very much, Linda and Rachel. If either of you have some closing comments you want to make, I think now's the time to do it.
So this is Rachel. Thank you all so much for listening. One comment that I'd make that we didn't address in detail in this webinar, but that we've talked about elsewhere, is understanding why color blindness doesn't work and helping your peers understand that. Sort of color blindness as sort of a general goal sort of seems like what we're striving toward, and obviously there's sort of back to the Dr. King speech, but color blindness actually, and there's some great research on this, often serves as an impediment to students of color feeling of belonging, and it can also be difficult for teachers if they think they're supposed to be colorblind to be able to engage in some of the specific interventions that Linda described and I was describing, because in a sense, those interventions are premised upon the idea of recognizing racial difference and recognizing that some efforts need to be made to ensure that racial difference is celebrated and valued as opposed to sort of subsumed under the notion that we're all the same.
Oh, yeah, I would absolutely concur with what Rachel just said. And who knows, that might even be a whole topic for our future webinar, talking about the importance of valuing diversity explicitly in institutions and the potentially detrimental effects of not addressing it and using a colorblind approach. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much, guys, and thank you to all the people who joined us on the phone and online. I'm going to hang up now, but I'm just reminding you that we're going to keep the webinar screen open for a little while longer. People can send additional Q&A in for us. Thanks so much, and we'll talk soon.